the usually the most important thing to consider is equivalences, right? Like I have a bunch of objects in the category, and how do I know when two of them are the same or maybe like almost the same? So at least connecting to Howell, like all these different metrics that he's giving, like the color Leibach divergence, all these different things are different ways of like they're metrics on the space, or their way of giving like distances between different points. So they're trying to give a difference, right? So they each measure a difference of a space in a different way. So like the KL divergence is like an entropy type of measurement. So it's saying that two things are like if you take this as, I guess, like your scale, two things are like equivalent in a sense if they like have a similar level of like chaos, I suppose, going on, or like entropy, right? And where the things cannot be like described by just like a simple rule, right? So I think, I don't know, it seems like just as like a beginning, these metrics are at least like a quasi equivalence. They like can give you not if two things are the same, but like if two things seem close together, maybe. Maybe a place to start. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense.
Makes sense to me, yeah.
Or if that's even right.
But I do feel there's an insight on there being two different strands on how to get more out of the whole than from the parts. Like it seems, I'm not sure yet if there are two different, like you have one way, like the synergistic way of getting more out of parts, like, so maybe like cooperation, like social cooperation is a way on how you actually design. It's kind of like a synergistic scale, like we get something in excess that if you try to like isolate into different parts, you necessarily lose whenever you go back to the level of the individual worker, right? But there seems to also be this kind of veiling way of getting more out of the parts. That's this way that's almost like the opposite. It's a state in which you have to forget what the parts are doing and treat it as a whole. But it's not that the whole is doing more, it's just that it's just an effect of this procedure of like closing access to like it's a way of making private the information within the parts, right? So like I think you use that to explain the way like wages and like social the reproduction of the worker must be like closed out of the production sphere in order to render like surplus value existing. So
yeah, but I mean, no, I see your point. Like the synergistic one seems very connected with, like, it seems more about, let's say, parts interacting in a way that the whole is larger than the parts. There's some access to the parts, right? And the other looks like you like there is some subtraction in the parts, so that the whole then has like, so that you actually get to see the proper whole of it, something like that, right?
Yeah. One thing I was gonna say, Renzo, what you said before about like I guess like you said something like the facts being like hidden on like a scale lower or something like that. That's like what we were talking about. I mean, a while ago. I forget where this comes from. I forget if it was from Badiou or not, about the definition of like a fact as something which is like a spatial property on a lower scale, right? So when you think about, I think the really good example was like color, for example, right? What color really is like a surface is basically how light bounces off of a surface based on like its microscopic properties and like how it's shaped on a very small scale that we cannot see, but like it comes off as like how the light is scattered, and that's, we see it as a color, as like the fact of the color as something that is lower. I mean, this is already also one of my questions, but we were also talked about the idea of like what would, I guess, like the reverse of this be, right? This is kind of like the forgetting is like a fact, not from like below where it's like underneath, but a fact sort of from above, right? It's more like universal. So at least in like a math example is like homology, which is like, I mean, if you imagine you're on like a donut, for example, right? There's like a hole in it. If you're on a small piece of it, you don't see the whole thing, right? So it's like a global property that you can only access like on a layer above, right?
Mhm.
It reminds me kind of the this like resolution functor. Yeah, it's talked about, which is something I want to go into also.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of see the difference between this veiling and the synergistic kind of ways that parts relate. Like the veiling seems to be about like you have a richer, you have access to a richer description of the parts, but that's not the resolution at which things are effective. So you actually need to opt like an epistemic option for a lower resolution that actually captures the relevant information. And since these resolutions don't need to be totally transitive in the sense that what's contained in one description is the same as what's contained in the other, when you choose the other, some properties make a difference that didn't make a difference in the more kind of specialized fine-grained description. So it has an epistemic feel because it feels like a phenomena doesn't change, but you're struggling to find the right resolution at which things are effective, right? Something like that. Whereas the synergistic one, it looks like resolution is itself caught up in the process where people get together, for example, they see themselves as a larger object, and then they redescribe the parts from the perspective of the larger object. So the parts look different to themselves, whereas in the veiling, it seems like they look differently for us. But that's not
actually
properly.
Yeah.
This actually was one of my 3 questions, which is basically like I feel like what Badiou calls a world and what we've been using is kind of this. It feels like an epistemological category in the sense that every world is just like a set of resolutions that has been chosen kind of arbitrarily, it feels like. And we know that worlds have something below that resolution, below the set of resolutions, there's something relevant, but we're just not counting it. And then then the whole drama of counting something that was not counted before and seeing how that affects the world. But I wonder if, I guess my question was like, what is the role of this concept of the world in our system, or what we've been kind of talking about? Like, is it, why is it useful to designate a world only to hide something that later on becomes visible? Like, what is
I don't know if it's really a utility necessary, but I think it's more that the wagers that every world is infinite, right? So like, if you're just like an observer in the world, you're just sitting there, you're never going to see the whole thing and you're never going to know what the whole thing is, right? So like ultimately, like this declaring of a world as a set of resolutions is like, right, isn't that an act that like, it's like an experimental act. You have to like see the world, see how it works, make a model of it, see if that is predictive, right?
Yeah, it's almost like it's a concept of the limitation of every model, right? It's like saying all models are finite and all models are capable of a set of resolutions, and then there is some kind of process that's not captured by the model that forms the basis of either a new model or this other thing that's not even a model, but something that's like attached to the model, supplementing it. Yeah, I guess when I said utility, I'm not sure exactly what I mean there. I was just very intuitively thinking about if epistemological categories like world are really, how do we make that like resonate with, for example, a political movement?
Yeah,
Do
but
they need a concept of a world?
yeah, but I mean, I disagree that it's a epistemological concept. Like it's being phenomenological. I mean, this is something that I'm more and more convinced that is like a really major point that's really hard to argue for. But the difference between seeing and knowing, I think it's or perceiving, rather than associating with a specific sense, but sensing and knowing, right? I think phenomenology is about sensing, but it's a generalized theory of, like, for example, when we say that the price of rice in China affects employment in Brazil, or to actually say something that is true, that the amount of pigs that China buys, right? The amount of soy that China buys from Brazil to feed its pigs affects the employment in Brazil. You're kind of saying that quantity of pigs and how much they're eating, it makes a difference to something else in a way that doesn't really matter what you think about it, right? It's precisely because of this sort of weird circuits of what makes a difference to what that, I mean, they didn't have to wait for Badiou to come up with the idea of world. Like Hegel had world history, talk about formations that make a difference to other formations, like they form the basis of something else. Or when Marx was writing, he talked about the world of commodities. And then in the 20th century, we had world system theory, which is a political theory. And the whole point is talking about circuits that kind of shape the world, shape reality, social reality, regardless of how we feel about them, right? Or how we consciously deal with them. Like they're not appearing to us. They don't necessarily make a difference to citizens or to individuals. They make a difference to other parts of the same kind of big systems, right? So in that, I think that there is a discourse on world as a political category, a long discourse, in fact, which goes from Hegel all the way to Wallerstein and systems theory people. What they don't have is like a phenomenological take on this, where you can actually talk about parts of the systems causing other parts or relating to other parts in terms that have this phenomenological feel to it, right? And then what I think, the reason why I think it's worth sticking to it is because, for example, if you're engaged in a political struggle from the standpoint of a small collective, right? You know a lot of things about totality because you read them in books, like about capitalism, about I don't know, patriarchy, but you don't sense many of those things. Like many of those things don't really make a difference to your existence as a collective. Like you don't get to interact with many of the things you know. You only know them abstractly, right? But for example, if you know that changes in currency, the emission of currency has an effect on things, but you don't get to interact with those things. Whereas if you're a national bank, it's not a matter of knowing. You might even know less than the small collective, but you actually sense it, right? You get to interact with those big kind of systemic aspects. So having a sort of this connection between what makes a difference in a system and this idea of what senses it, which I think in like controller theory, cybernetics already had like a proto theory of these things, right? But it's kind of sketchy and a bit romanticized as well. But it's kind of a meeting point between world systems theory and that sort of approach, I think. So I don't think it's epistemological. It's not about the theory you have about the world, right? Or the model that you make about a dynamic. It's about how parts of a dynamic interact with another, right? For example, the classic controller theory example of the thermostat. Like, it needs to be composed in some way so that it is affected by the temperature and so that it can affect the temperature in the room. There are other things being affected by the temperature that have no, or things in the room for which the temperature makes no difference. Like they're not formed as immanent entities of that system, right? Even though they're materially there. Like,
Yeah. So you're saying that the concept of world is in the interface between two systems in a way, like because the temperature, the thermometer is its own system, but its environment is also a system. And what we call world is really what is sensible between one system to another.
yeah, I don't think that that's the definition of system. Like I would call the thermometer a subsystem of the temperature system of the room. I wouldn't call it like a closed, it's precisely meant to interact
Right. Yeah.
right with the changing temperature. So you won't understand the logic of the thermostat properly if you don't treat it as an open system, right? I mean, the properties that Badiou gives worlds is precisely they're closed, even though they're infinite. So it's a very specific type of closure. It's not just like a finite system, right? But that you're worried about differences that make a difference in that system. So it's like trying to come up with the very general theory of under which conditions something makes a difference to something else in that same system, right? But giving it enough kind of, it needs to be rich enough that you can fully say that those differences make a difference to other parts of the same world, and not just like saying that I don't know, a piece of paper, a marked piece of paper makes a difference for the piece of paper. Like, yeah, but the piece of paper is not in that sense a world. It lacks other properties, right? Whereas, for example, if you're writing a text, you perhaps could say, like, if you're doing like a drawing where parts of the piece of paper are interacting with other parts of the piece of paper under certain logics that are immanent to that construction, you could say that a marking makes a difference for the drawing, right? So I don't think the world is epistemological.
Yeah.
And I think
I might agree. I think this comes at like, I think this is like one of the fundamental impasses that is like at the core of kind of everything, which is like this gap of language always being, right, like a finite set of list of words or sentences, right? It's always finite versus like infinite consequences. Like, right, if a world is infinite, then even the act of declaring a world is like a huge jump, whether it's like discovered or constructed, whichever way you look at it, right? There's already that jump just saying this is a world, right? Like that's already like a huge,
yeah.
Like,
I think that's always at like that one of these fundamental like language impasses, just because of how.
yeah, I was just thinking that when we talk about change in Badiou, or even change in the primer or whatever, we've been trying to rank different degrees of change, right? And so we make this division between change that's kind of expected, naively, just to say naively, like it's within the parameters of the system as we understand it. and there's some change that isn't within those parameters. And that's where I feel like that's where epistemology kind of seems to appear again, because where's that line between, where's that line coming from? I mean, I'm just asking this, like, kind of trying to think against ourselves a bit, because I like, I mean, of course, I think the world is a really important concept. I don't want to give it up, but I'm just trying to think of like possible critiques from the standpoint of a political movement saying, like, you've defined a world such that you can surprise yourself when something doesn't fit it, but you're the one who chose the parameters of that world. So
yeah, but that's why I think that we should divide, like, I think that if you need to have a distinction between, let's say, something like a theory as something which makes something intelligible, and a theory as something that predicts everything that can happen. Like, they're not the same things. Like, to say that it helps you can see more stuff if you think about like this multi-layered thing, if you consider that sometimes phenomena are more consistent when you don't think they're appearing to you. For example, things look irrational. Oh my God, there's a fire in the middle of the ocean. Like, that looks irrational, like totally crazy. If you consider that, I don't know, the relevance of if people are going to drill oil there or not, that's not a decision that is made pondering all possible risks, but it's made pondering, let's say, profitability and other things more than others. Suddenly it is more intelligible what's going on, perhaps, right? It doesn't need to, I mean, I wonder, for example, if your question would make sense directly on, let's say, capital. Like, Marx talks about the value form, and then he asks about what is not the value form. But isn't he just setting himself up by limiting what there is? I don't think that that's the main purpose of the value form, right? To establish the limit of what can be. It's just to say, like, okay, this helps you to see more stuff. One of the things you can see, perhaps, is like the bargain is you get to see more if you adopt this perspective, but you also get to see what is unlikely, right? That's part of what you get to see, like things that are very unlikely.
yeah, I see what you mean.
I'm not sure if that answers it, but I think it's an important question. I'm just trying to understand why you would call it an epistemological, like.
Yeah, Badiou has that term, the encyclopedia, right? Like,
yeah, I would say that you only get, like, because you're asking about the gap between, like, when you can say something is expected versus unexpected in the world, right? That only comes up once you're in a world, but also have a model of that world, right? That has some predictive power, right? Because when you're in the world, that doesn't mean that you necessarily, like, even have a model of how it works. Just because you're in some world that is infinite, right? That, what was his exact, or it just has to be like closed, infinite. Yeah, I forget his abstract philosophical definition. But
it's closed, infinite, and every relation is universally exposed. Every object is seen by another object in the same world.
Yeah, so for that, like, you don't even need, that doesn't require, there's no requirement for a model. So I think the epistemological part comes in once a model is developed, right? So that already assumes like a subject acting in the world in some way. No, maybe, I don't know.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's what that's Jameson's position as well. Like, for example, he will say that Marx describes in Capital a totality, and then theories are done inside the totality. So, for example, he doesn't criticize bourgeois economists simply in the sense that my model goes against yours. It's like you describe the sort of domain, and you have a richer framework in which to see why the models of others are restricted or distorting or something like this, right? So I think it's, I mean, you made a really good point on this, Dennis, when you wrote the whole thing on the 20 questions, right? To say, talk about the conditions on the game of 20 questions is not to create a model of it, is to create, let's say, the stakes for the model, right? Like these games will have these and these properties. Okay, so now if you want to come up with a good strategy to win it, or if you want to kind of describe a game with, that's happening inside that space. That's not the space itself.
Mhm. How do you think that would translate over to like a political example, for example?
Yeah, I think, for example,
do you
we are
have-
not, for example, I think it's very clear, like when you define that, well, you increase intelligibility, which again, it's a, for me, it's a distinction between sensing and, or making intelligible in this, it's not immediate, but it's non-intellectual perhaps way versus knowing, right? So when you make intelligible, when you propose that a multi-layered complex system makes more phenomena intelligible about a capitalist social formation, you suddenly have something to say about why unidimensional models miss something out. Did you make a model? Like, not necessarily, like you're not saying any particular statements about this sort of structure. You're just saying that, well, if a totality is complex in this way, now let's see the models that are available. Well, it's very likely that they're reductive in one way or another because they are trying to grasp that with these small resources. So you can tell things about, like you can propose conditions for good models or for better models without having constructed one.
Yeah.
Right, it's not the same thing.
Mhm.
I think that's the impression that I get. Like it's a compelling, it's supposed to be a compelling, useful kind of tool for making more phenomena intelligible. And if it holds, then some consequences also hold for however you want to model reality. Like you would be in your best interest to take those into consideration, right?
So you're saying whenever like we bring in this, like, for example, this like 20 questions idea, you always need to have some constraints that already come from the world itself, right? Which constrain what can be asked and what can be answered, basically.
Yeah, for example, you can I think, which is pretty much what Badiou does in his even broader version, right? He doesn't tell you like novelty appears in this way, novelty appears in that way. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. He just says that if there are kind of if there are regularities in a world, meaning if there is a cohesive logic of what makes a difference in a certain system, this imposes some constraints on what you can expect for something to be singular, or for something to produce something that couldn't emerge any other way. Like this creates some conditions for this. Now, does this mean that I'm telling you how you should act? No, you still have to do everything by yourself, but at least you know that it is possible under certain conditions that something singular might emerge. And if it does, it has some thinkable tasks, like that you can actually think ahead, concern yourself with, consider as it's happening, and things like this. So it seems like it broadens the sort of thing you would take into consideration, but it doesn't answer what it is, right? But I'm not sure if that's the issue that Dennis was raising, though.
Yeah, I had the impression, I'm not sure if I understood it, but that it was a bit related with the question I had, which is, yeah, I tried to send it the link, but I don't know if it's working, but
yeah, I managed to open it.
Yeah,
we got it.
But yeah, it's about the relationship between we being able to come up with the framework on like an organizational point of view of politics and the relationship with particular like political orientations, like are all of those like the existing political orientations internal to our framework? Like they should be able to appear the way the differences between them should be able to appear as different like constraints inside our space, or in some sense we're also conditioned by certain choices that have like practical consequences that we have to kind of like also unfold. I feel there's the two things are probably possible and likely. So I mean, I think it's related to like what change, what the real change is depends on what counts as change, depends a lot on like a political orientation, right? What's interesting and what's not interesting is what defines, I think, a political orientation. So does our framework like stops before and just try to be like maximally make intelligible everything that could appear, or that's not possible? Not sure if it was clear. Maybe like,
I'm just finishing reading it now.
yeah, okay, yeah, maybe it's easier than me trying to explain.
Should we maybe share screen to put it on the recording?
Sorry, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Here. Just finishing reading it now.
See, I do think this ties in a bit to what I was saying, I think before, about the difference between, I guess this is like the phenomenological and the epistemological difference, right? That I think political orientations appear at least more clearly and fully formed at the level of a model, right? Because at least on some level, okay, this is not universally true, but to some degree, many people with different political orientations could say that they have the same goal, right? Which is like some abstract human flourishing. But the differences actually come out in the way that they model the space, right? That they say this one strategy will be effective and this one other strategy will not be effective. Like, I mean, the most frequent like defense of like capitalism as a whole that I think I hear, and maybe you hear as well, is just like, look what it's done. It's like nothing's worked better. It's made everyone as rich as possible, blah, 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 right? Which is ultimately an argument from the stance of the model, right? Saying that I already have this model for how to measure what is good, what is bad, which is already a bias, right? So it's maybe at the epistemological level where the main differences come about here, but I'm not sure.
Yes, if I understood correctly, the first part of the question is that there is a prescriptive or kind of positive content behind the project itself. Therefore, this is kind of already going to put a bias on this sort of descriptive approach to you know, like kind of pseudo naive saying, but this is just a toolkit to see how things, yeah, but you kind of already prepare the ground for things to look in one way rather than the other, like, or for some things to look more consistent than others.
Yeah, but I don't think that even is a bad thing. Like it's
Yeah, but I don't think it's a bad thing as well, though. You know, like that's why I try to end that presentation on kind of summarizing things we've been doing this far with that quote from the Communist Manifesto, where I think it's a good kind of trying to suggest that there is something prescriptive about communism or a communist approach that should contain a good deal of flexibility as to what goes with it, right? When he says, well, but there shouldn't be a separate communist thing, like it shouldn't constitute itself as a separate thing, so it should make a big effort to just get to see the movement as a whole, right? Or there's different parties as part of this of a common thing. So to be prescriptively concerned with communist phenomenology, why not? Should be, let's say, conductive to being very careful with having as many descriptive tools as possible, right? So it should, I don't think it's like a glitch that one thing is behind the other, like a commitment to something behind the project, because I think you can very explicitly claim that the basic kind of strategic communist point of view is to be very flexible with very different strategies that are going around, right? And trying to find how do you actually describe them from the standpoint of the whole, as he says. So I don't know, I find that I don't find that hard to kind of integrate, though I do think it's hard to, like I was talking to Dennis earlier today, and I had this in the back of my mind, like you know, like it's almost to me that if you bring Logics of Worlds down from the sort of very abstract philosophical description, which it gets to be organized the way that it is as a book, because it is making the purposeful kind of it's committing itself purposefully to being very vague or very abstract. The moment that it started to describe, let's say, a political world, meaning the moment that it's no longer describing the generic, the very basic conditions for a generic procedure, but it puts itself within a generic procedure, it becomes a situated thing. And the theory of the sites, the theory of change, those things actually probably would have to come in the beginning, because those are the basic commitments. Like you can't start a book like that has a political tone from nowhere. Like from the very principles of Logics of Worlds, that wouldn't be possible, right? If the theory of sites is about novelty having a situated material, how could a political version of Logics of Worlds not start from that basic site, right? So I do wonder sometimes how clearly this should be elaborated in our project, that, you know, okay, but shouldn't these commitments be very clear, the material behind it to be very clear, and should there really be a theory of a site or a theory of change, like as if it's not predetermined in some way by the very beginning of the project, you know, like shouldn't you just make explicit the commitments to certain forms of change? Wouldn't that be more kind of productive? The reason why I think that it doesn't need to go that far in that direction is just because if you take the standpoint of the book to still be, let's say, more concrete than Logics of Worlds, in the sense that it's dealing with capitalist social formations and what's possible inside of them, but slightly less concrete than any particular struggle today, and taking that description of communism from the manifesto as a sort of guideline, there is enough situatedness in moving from logics of worlds to this sort of description of commodity exchange, state, blah, 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 there's already an enrichment in the sort of methodological position of saying, well, you can see these things better if you take them as objective phenomenological structures, and if you take them as composing together these complex objects. This already has consequences for looking at political movements. So it is kind of a petition of principle, a prescription, but it's mostly methodological, right? And it still kind of leaves open the space for saying like, well, but I don't know, we can't really anticipate what will come from looking at things in this way. But we can, let's say, formulate some challenges that are consistent with the description we just gave, right? So I think that kind of intermediary level of being more concrete than logics of worlds, but still not let's say fully embedded in a specific political process, where most of these things probably wouldn't necessarily be immediately interesting, right? I think it deserves the title of like a communist project precisely because there's something about its motivations that emerge when you try to look across a bunch of problems. Like if you just focused on a more localized thing, probably it wouldn't emerge, like some of these issues wouldn't emerge so clearly, I guess. But I don't know, it is a big issue.
Yeah, because in our conversation, we were talking about the fact that free association is kind of a generic capacity that seems to almost precede political engagement. The political engagement comes in when that free association needs to be somehow safeguarded or built, like when you're trying to actually build something on top of that. But yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking that with regards to Renzo's question about this, it's like our framework is about the conditions required to make free association productive. But there can be many different political orientations that appear from that.
Yeah, for example, I don't think that what you said about populism, I don't think it would be consistent to claim, for example, that, I mean, since there is no specific material, like we're not choosing like who is the political subject or what is the effective intervention. Nothing prevents, for example, a process that only deals with coming up with slogans and organizing discourses to be treated as a kind of composition of something that has effects. And I think that there is, I mean, now that you said this, I think that there is actually a very, actually it's a very profound kind of argument for perhaps like this middle ground, you know. And why is it that it's this mixture of certain aspect of communist, which is not strategy proper, like it's a weird name we should find for that. Like strategies, every political movement has their own strategies and their ways of looking at things. So it's not about strategy, but there's something about the sort of compositional I don't know, we may have to find a good word for this, like yeah, work or whatever you want to call it, like this of bringing together different projects or finding how they can compose together. That is a very practical thing. I think that you can actually historically argue that while certain things were in place, you didn't need to worry about this. This was kind of automatically supposedly solved by itself. So if everyone just works on their stuff, they will all kind of coalesce together into something bigger by itself. And the changing certain historical conditions, this is not teleologically guaranteed. So in those conditions, you need to worry about this, right? So that would be, let's say, the common in communism, and making sure that different political processes actually cohere in the same direction without actually coming up with a larger program which has a larger positive content that's supposed to subsume all of them under it, right? And on the other hand, it actually justifies why phenomenology is a concern, because what does it mean to look at very different political projects that speak of themselves in very different ways, think of themselves with very different tools, and look for these commonalities, right? That would justify both parts of the equation. The sort of methodologic one, it comes from looking for the common parts, right? And the sort of sensible one, or which is from what does it mean to look for these common parts? Like, what should you be looking at, right? Which is, I think, the phenomenology comes in. So I think it does have a positive content, but it's I don't necessarily see how it would be like. I mean, I think we can come up with some processes that would not cohere. For example, a nihilistic project that seeks to, I don't know, explode a nuclear warhead and decimate or start World War III or something like this. Well, it's possible that something like this won't really, it's not like something that you can conceive of as enriching the ecosystem of the left with a new experiment. It might just decimate it all. I think in that case, I'm happy to say it's removed from the picture, you know, like that it is inconsistent. But I think I don't think we're committing to some axioms that make that reduce drastically, let's say, that idea of building a perspective that is richer than the capitalist perspective, and it allows for possibly many different prescriptive projects appearing. It seems like, though we haven't really thought about it much, like probably it would be nice to develop an example. For example, things that are radically distinct, like anarchist, more invisibilized, decentralized collectives, a set of anarchist collectives, and a hardline leftist party. Like, can you imagine? Can you actually describe these things as existing in the same space? Like, is this approach rich enough to actually describe these things as rich? Is this the same space and having any sort of connection? You know. But I mean, at least at first, it doesn't seem like an impossible challenge. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the whole thing of like looking for the common part is an interesting like application to concrete political practice, because if you compare it to like in the time Marx was writing, when like I guess like the like ideal worker was like the factory worker, but now like things have been, I guess, like disseminated throughout so much that there is no like, or it's much harder to say what is like the prototypical worker on aggregate in some way, right? So it's very, it makes it more difficult to find what is common, right? What is common isn't necessarily just like the intersection of everything in some sort of naive way.
Yeah,
because it could be very complicated, and it's like it's difficult. Like what does like a white collar office worker have in common with like a coal worker? It's difficult. I mean, like from their experiences and from their perspective, it's difficult to say concretely today. You know?
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that we should spend some time. I think that Rodrigo Nunes' book makes a really good case in one of the chapters on these three properties that were classic in the theory of revolution, which were a teleology, like it's necessarily going to happen. There is a transitivity between your social position. Like there is some social group that due to its social status will have a political status, right? And then the third is that it's illemorphic in the sense that you can actually give form to it from the outside, right? And the form will kind of shape the content. And his theory is that in the 20th century, these three theses were destroyed. Like there is no necessity that from capitalist logic, it will beget a different system. There are perhaps tendencies that you can take advantage or not. There is no transitivity. Actually, that's Badiou's critique. The term comes from Badiou. There is no social position that it's directly, constructing a useful revolutionary political subject. Like the crisis of the factory worker as this sort of proto-revolutionary didn't just shift it to someone else. So let's say racialized, oppressed subjects are therefore the new revolutionary subjects. On the contrary, a lot of interesting transgender or anti-colonial theorists, they're all about saying like that this sort of investment on oppressed figures, as if they not only need to survive, but they also need to change everything. It's kind of fetishized, right? So this transitivity between a part of society, the transformation of the whole, was also broken. And third, that there is nobody can think of, the one form that will drive the revolution forward. And those three things kind of are destroyed. So I think that what we're talking about, what is this communist phenomenology, is very much fitting for these three things, right? If there are only tendencies, how do you look at them? Like you need to see them, because it's not a law in the sense that, I think that's also nice about having moved from the law of value in Capital to a logic of a world, meaning like things that make a difference tend to have this form. So it's good to be aware of this form, right? But that doesn't mean it will lead you to somewhere else. It's a closed world. It's not going to create a new world out of nowhere. So the theory of worlds is kind of fitting with a non-teleological thing. It's neither a law, like everything is exactly like this, but it's just saying that things that make a difference in this space tend to have this form. Is non-transitive because we are saying nothing about, therefore migrants are the new revolutionary subjects. Therefore, white collar workers are the new revolutionary subjects. We're not looking for the common part in class composition. We're looking for the common part in already subjectivized political movements, right? That's actually the core of the quote from Marx. Like he didn't say the communists are the most resolute parts of the proletariat. They said the most resolute parts of the proletariat that are struggling, like in political parties, social movements, and so on. And it's the common part between these, let's say, fragmented political subjects, right? And then it's also not hilomorphic in the sense it's imposing a form, because the point is, how do you see the forms that are appearing, and what would be good to have in mind while you're working on different political struggles, so that there is a chance that these fragmented forms might actually, like Dennis said, right, have like ports that allow them to interact in any way, so reinforce one another, right? So I think it's very fitting, we could actually spend some time giving good historical reasons why this becomes like a relevant topic like a relevant position to construct, whereas before it was given to be something that would be kind of produced automatically, right? Like the idea of a society of work, for example, we solved everything. Society of work is both a capitalist society, but it's also pregnant with a future socialist society. So we know that one law creates another world. It tells us who is the transitive part that has something to say about the whole, which is the factory worker. And we had the idea that a party, for example, is a good way to organize those workers so that their force is maximized, and that world that by law will happen faster, something like that, right? So those problems had an answer, at least.
Yeah, I think it's interesting where you said about the fetishization of like oppressed categories, and how that seems to come about from, I guess, like sort of similar to what I was saying before, of like this like naive intersection of everything, right?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
just say like the ideal, I guess, like, or not ideal citizen, but like the citizen
That's
from
oppressed
which,
from everywhere. Like,
yeah, and it's like the subject where you have to take every position from, and it,
yeah.
not to say that like that's a bad thing to take from like the perspective of that subject, but like when you reduce it to that, it both fetishizes it and flattens
But
it.
you know, like when I started reading about this sort of, I can try to find a text on this, because it was written by many different positions, like this sort of fetishization that, for example, the Black movement, which is sometimes dealing with, let's say, just constructing the possibility of surviving in a very hostile social environment, that it should also account for the aspirations of mostly white militant class that is feeling like it's nostalgic for a past where it was, its future was kind of, its socialist future was on the table. The interesting thing is that when I started reading about that, it seemed like you could apply it to even to, let's say, the working class itself. Like, there's a lot of resentment from working class people, from the fetishization that they should see themselves as, leftist, progressive, revolution, as if life is not hard enough as it is, in that sense, there is a sort of, I feel like there is a bit of a relief on conservative right-wing politics of proposing that they are revolutionary because they don't do anything. Like, by concerning themselves with their own survival, they're being revolutionary. It's different. While the left is asking people who are struggling more and more to not only struggle in their private lives, but also to give a bit more to go somewhere, to get somewhere else, so I don't know. I think that this critique of transitivity is really, really powerful. Like, to not simply believe that historical changes shifted who is the new, where is the revolutionary subject? You're just gonna find it somewhere else. Like, it's no longer in the factory, it's this other guy here. And like the refugee, fuck, the guy is swimming across the ocean. He also needs to change your life,
Yeah, so then it becomes more about connecting. I was thinking about this, of creating shared resources, and maybe this is a way to frame the problem of, you have different movements. You don't want to kind of overburden these movements with doing too much on, they're trying to solve a particular problem or set of problems, and there may be something that grows out of that. Maybe a group that started off protesting police brutality may eventually become also the same kind of group that tries to solve poverty in their communities, right? And there could be overlaps, but to try to force that condition on those movements, or to try to assume that there's some natural progression from one type of movement to another, that's doing too much. So instead, we should be creating a set of shared resources that, or this idea of the ports that you're bringing up again, like. And I guess my question would be, what do we have a theory of this, of a set of we called it in the primer, we called it a toolkit. And I think at the time we meant more like a toolkit for thinking these things, but maybe also there's the question of like material shared resources, you know, that become available. Like, do we have a name for making resources available to different groups?
I feel like I'm not sure if it's like the same idea, but like something that this idea of solidarity, which was like the name of the force that bonded people together in struggle, is like a really, I think it's dated in a sense that it's like the subjective aspect of something. Like Gabriel was saying that we could count with before, and now, and we just had to name this kind of like subjective part of being of solidarity just emerging in struggle. But there's this like material part which I think includes sharing resources, but it's this sort of like work, which I don't know, we can call it like compositional work that appears regardless of what, and I think in this sense it's indifferent to political orientations, because everyone who organizes has to do this kind of work. So it's common in the sense that it's really indifferent to the ends, right? Because everyone has to do this kind of like binding of like getting to struggle against something. You need to coordinate this struggling against, right? So sort of work that, I guess the idea is that it's not what produces this, like what socializes the struggle is not historically available anymore in the same sense. Like, I think having a theory of that is interesting, right? A theory of how composition is constructed in like political action, like sharing resources and like using time and like having to coordinate like everything, like all sorts of that involve the reproduction of movements, political movements in general.
Yeah, I think that, for example, solidarity was, I totally agree with you. I think it was supposed to name this sort of objective compositional kind of process, but it's very hard to see anything objective about it today, because it's used sometimes just as this empty kind of I support your message kind of thing. But I think that, for example, we've been, when we first said about like, okay, what does it mean to look at, not only look at, for example, I think that we have a clearer sense today of what it means to look at economy organizationally. For example, we spend a long time describing like in a compositional way with the same tools that we talk about cooperation, we can now talk about money. Like with the primary, I think it goes far in that direction. The other side of the equation is harder to talk about, which is, what does it mean to look at organization economically? Which I think is what this objective basis of solidarity is about. Like, what would it mean to give, I think, like cooperation a similar social existence or a similar intelligibility as you give competition, right? If you take competition to be the sort of principle of social cohesion that brings together organizations in a capitalist world, right? They compete and they exchange information in that way. They actually share resources through competition, right? To think about cooperation occupying a similar place. So it's not cooperation inside an organization, but cooperation as a layer or almost like at the level of circulation, as a principle that you know that you're guiding yourself through it, others are guiding themselves through it. Therefore, some things will be made common, some things will be shared, that you will bet on furthering your struggle through the furthering of the other struggle, even though, right, you don't need to subjectively agree. Competition has that similar aspect, right? Competition makes coordination without intersubjective agreement. On the contrary, the least you agree, the better it works. Whereas cooperation doesn't necessarily mean agreement. And I have the impression that like looking at organization economically has something to do with that. And I think, again, Rodrigo Nunes' book, he calls this an ecology. He says, well, exactly as Renzo said, like ultimately it's always the case that organizations are kind of inserted in the same world somehow, and they do have effects on one another, even though they don't want it. It's like, you might not think about it, you might not care about it, but well, you might be taking resources away from other organizations when you organize against some other position on the left. So it is resource sharing, it is all those things already happening, right? I wonder if ecology isn't a bit too, if it doesn't have other connotations that economy doesn't, like, or vice versa, because there's a slight difference between, right? Ecology seems a bit more, let's say, evolutive and free kind of forming, right? Perhaps, whereas economy does look a bit more constrained. I don't know. But regardless of that, it does seem like all those ideas kind of fit into this particular realm we're talking about, right? Which is not making claims about what people should be doing, but perhaps adding some claims of the form, well, I don't know what you're going to be doing, but perhaps you might want to consider that others are doing stuff as well. Like, and this might actually have an effect, right? Like, one thing that concerns this, I was talking to Dennis today, and I think that this became a bit clearer for me. Like, for example, competition has a weird mix between singularity, in the sense that you do want to find something new that is not yet has a price, and you want to incorporate that into what is a value. So surplus, right? Surplus does require something singular to be at stake if you want to increase your profit rate. But at the same time, competition is a rule, so it's a constraint. You don't want to explore novelty to the point that it leads you to break, for example, with the commodity form, right? You're not gonna, let's say, you have all this Google and like this smart companies coming up with this pseudo improvements of work conditions, right? Oh, now you have I don't know, company car, and you have this nice work environment, but they don't want to take it so far as to simply not be a company anymore. Or the latest work improvement we came up with, we're just going to turn it into a cooperative, and everyone is a shareholder. Like, there is a limit. So
it's the same thing like with what Henry Ford did at the beginning of the century by paying people more. His whole thing was that people would be more productive and would work more.
Yeah, exactly. So there is something about innovation, but there is a constraint, right? And I think that cooperation probably means something similar, in the sense that if you take Badiou's project as is, it seems like the more singular a political process is, the better, right? There is no, let's say, global counterpart clarity. Like, to extract at most from the material, to go as deep into the unformed part of a situation seems always the best if you can bring something new to the table. But you could add a condition, like, there's no point of bringing something new to the table if it, let's say, doesn't respect the connectivity principle, with other new things. So it's not the same thing as competition, where new things are constrained by old principles, right? But it still is a weird condition where new things are conditioned by other new things, right? So you could imagine cooperation or solidarity actually describing a positive constraint on singular processes that still keeps them singular, but does add some more structure to the picture, I don't know, something like that.
This sort of reminds me of how I think like economic incentives are often talked about, especially like within capitalism, where like the standard defense, right, is that like how will for example, innovation ever happen without competition, right? But I don't know. I've been thinking about this recently, where like that line really only applies to the capitalists themselves, right? Because they're the only ones that are actually directly and immediately benefiting from the company profiting. Like on the level of an individual, right? Their incentives are to not get fired, essentially, to feed their family, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I also like this ties in, I think, very well to, especially in the modern economy, with like the whole bullshit jobs. You know, people, especially in like certain white collar, get away with what they can get away with, and then that ends up having these jobs that like don't do anything, right? I think there's a mismatch between like how we usually consider incentives, but these incentives really don't, like, it's almost like when you talk about incentives in the way you're only seeing, it's almost as if you're assuming that everyone is a capitalist, is a capital owner, right? Like okay, sure, if everyone was a capital owner themselves, if everyone had their own company that profited, maybe then yeah, the profit incentive would work for everyone in a way. Not saying it would be good, but that's just not true, right? It seems like it's connected.
Yeah, no, I think it's totally connected. I mean, there's this point that Dennis always brings up, that there's this book, this paper called Theory of the Firm, that deals with why aren't companies structured, you know, as money exchanges inside their own structure, right? So actually, you get this sort of filter, like this membrane between external profit incentives and internal cooperative incentives. Like,
Yeah.
perhaps incentives is a strong word for the cooperative structure, but capitalism is, and this was something that for me was very striking about working on the primer, that it really made in my head like this very kind of horrendous picture of, you know, capitalism as a sort of, it looks like from inside the world, it looks like this, it's all made of priceable commodity parts, but when it leaches onto production sites, it always opens up like a door to something cooperative, where you can actually suck something from it and then enclose it back into value, right? So and it has there is a nice kind of formal counterpart to that, which is ultimately value is totally ordered on money, but prices, like parts of labor and means of production, are not totally ordered, right? You have this weird lattice structures of what comes before, what comes later. Like, time is not totally ordered in production because it's happening in many directions at the same time, though money is ultimately totally ordered. So there is always a weird mapping, right, of a richer structure back on this totally ordered measure, right? Which I think is why ultimately kept inside the firms cannot be structured or through direct money exchange. You need to explore these weird ramifications, right? Where somebody does a bit of a task, somebody does another bit. Like, you can't really evaluate directly on those half tasks. You evaluate on the full thing, and that you can be actually priced, right? Sometimes it's harder to price the. So I don't know. I think that there is something nice to describe in this way, right? That something about, like, perhaps solidarity, just to change from corporations to keep the two levels separate, right? You could have something like solidarity as a restrictive logic, where there are singularities, things that you do singularly through political processes, dealing with specific people in specific places and going after specific things, but you're adding a constraint, which is, how is it that these things get to circulate afterwards or to compose with others, right? You don't even have to have a theory of what is the common thing, as if there is one thing. Like, every political process needs to share material resources or financial structures. You don't need to commit to those specific things. You can still have a theory of the fact that some commitment or some common solidarity needs to be constructed because it's not a given, and therefore be aware of that without necessarily knowing beforehand what the common parts will be, right?
Yeah. I was going to comment on that. That to say that there is such a, like a common sort of like activity that needs to compose stuff doesn't mean like it's not something that can be kind of like enunciated from like a neutral
Yeah.
ground that would say just like like the left has to get along. There must be like some
Yeah,
sort of
exactly.
nice ecology of the left. I think it's more like it's still something situated, like it's still like the interiority of the political processes that from which you compose stuff is
Mhm.
still like politically oriented, right? So
Yes,
sometimes
exactly.
the most like composed like for a certain process, the most like I think that the
The
coherent
composable.
the
Yeah.
composable like force is sometimes to kind of like make like divisions that will exclude certain like organizations. So it's I think it's a relative and it's not something that we can like enunciate from the outside. It's something that the
Yeah.
interiority of the process is able to do or do, but it's something that it has to take into account.
Yeah, because this is something. I mean, this takes me to one of the questions that I wanted to bring. Like, I had two questions actually. One of the third one we already talked about, like probability, like how to bridge the gap, formal gap between probability treatment of complexity and this more structural categorical approach to complexity, which, I mean, it's a big issue. But the other two questions that I had were one which is it's both are technical, but one is like a challenge, which is how the hell, once we have these three transcendental substructures, what does it mean to talk about objects that are composed, like irreducibly composed of the three, right? So an object in a nation state capital system should actually not be reducible to, let's say, unilateral descriptions of any of the three things. So what does it mean to construct objects in that way? I don't think we really moved very far in that direction. But just leaving that question aside, the other question that connects more to what we're talking about, I mean, the thing that really kind of gave me the chills when we were reading those optics and lenses stuff was this duality between the optic description and the comb thing, right? Which, like, more than one text talks about in kind of analogy to organize, like a system and its environment. So you kind of get this two concepts, but the structure of each of them is actually the same, right? So the kind of the lens thing there with the the bidirectional thing with the prop stuff, actually the comb that kind of takes the inputs and the outputs, it can just unpack it and look at it as another one of those same systems, right? So it's ridiculously Bogdanovian to see like systems and environments, and it actually connects a lot with what Pedro was also presenting with Ludix, where like games are treated as games between a system makes a move, then the environment makes a move, then the system makes a move again. So it connected with that discussion, which is, I don't know, an interesting discussion on logic and so on. Connects with Bogdanov, for whom you have a relative, like a perspectival distinction between environment and organization, right? And one of our last meetings, I felt like we reached a really interesting point, which I think connects exactly what we're talking about, with the idea that perhaps the added step to the kind of Badiouian framework is precisely one where you move from a sort of political organization to this perspective shift, right? Where your organization can become part of a system of constraints for other organizations. That's pretty much what we're talking about right now. I don't know which constraint will make a difference to that particular organization. It might be that what's relevant is making itself different from the previous process. But nevertheless, it seems like understanding how to talk about the shifts between bodies or as a sort of novel organizational, novel system, constructing some sort of coherence, and then describing the same thing as the environment for other bodies, right? Is kind of a good kind of formal way to move forward with this question of what does it mean to add sort of constraint to singular political processes without saying too much about what these constraints are, right? Perhaps talking about that shift from a political process becomes a constraint on other things is a good one. So yeah, what's up with that? That's my question. So how about that?
Yeah, it's a huge question. Yeah, I mean, we need to definitely study the optics and Combs things more, but it seems like we have to interpret what is being passed from the environment to the system, right? I mean, I guess you're making decisions, but these decisions are yielding some kind of feedback, right?
Yeah,
So-
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Can I ask really quick? Are we interpreting an organization as a sort of lens in the sense that it does stuff, gets output, and then tries to change itself to do that stuff better? Yes.
Yeah,
Maybe?
I don't even understand that part. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like the task, if this is a kind of sub research project, I would divide it into 2 or 3 parts. Like, is there any meaningful way in which this sort of generic theory of inquiries that Badiou develops from being an event to logics of worlds, the sort of piecemeal construction of, you know, decisions or inquiries or investigations, or what we kind of tentatively call experimentation as well? I mean, just making a parenthesis here, the thing we just said about, let's say, cooperation being a interesting constraint on singularity, I think that's exactly what distinguishes experimentation from experience. Experience is really singular, right? And experimentation is an experience constrained to some sort of circulation, right? You can have very complex restrictions with scientific experiments, restrictions based on a very weird mixture of singularity and repeatability, right? But I think it also ties to that issue. Like, it gives concrete meaning to why I call these experiments, right? But like, closing the parentheses, like, I think the first step in the research is this question: like, can we connect something like a process of searching for something true or constructing something true in this generic sense to the machinery of these lenses and para optics, whatever, because there is one thing I don't like about that association, which is something I've heard often when I was starting to try to present to people something about being an event. And I always use these examples like, you want to understand what the generic is. Imagine like you have a set that has a property P, and then that tells you that whatever it is that you add to the set next cannot have property P. Now, once you've added it, it has property Q. Now you know that the next thing cannot have property Q. But that sounds like a small algorithm. You can just apply it. And people just made the connection. Like, isn't this kind of algorithmic kind of just a kind of very simple protocol, right? And I don't like that much the association between a sort of, you know, the sort of machine learning thing with the generic thing. I don't think it goes very far. Like, I think it feeds off it gives food for the wrong crowd. So I don't know how to look. I would say, like, that's the first part, seeing if the kind of learning system and generic forcing stuff has any connection, which is actually a technical problem as well, right? not just a metaphor, and then seeing what that means for what does it mean to look like you make this inside out move with the combs with regards to optics, and then you should be able to make a similar move with these generic multiplicities, right? Or some weird version of them. So it sounds absolutely bonkers. Like, just yeah, but
On the second idea of like turning like the system of the environment inside out, I think it like answers something that I had this question I had for some time, which is precisely like there seems to be like an important politically meaningful shift from when you consider an organization as kind of like the body, which has parts which are like militants that act onto like the environment, which is normally like the movement. So it treats itself as a body, and it acts like it can sense stuff in the movement and act based on its internal like components. It has certain capacities to act into the movement. And then, but then there's, I think, a nice shift that I think can be treated in this kind of like inversion. That's when a movement starts to be able to be the body and treat the organization as a part, as an organ of itself, which is like some political process are able to pass from to it starts to make sense to treat a political process like a movement, like a strike or a revolt or something, to take it in terms of how the organizations, the organized parts, like act for the movement itself. So it's when the environment that organizations were acting on starts to become the system that either, I don't know, act on like the bigger totality of the environment becomes something even bigger, or you know what I mean? Like
yeah, no, it makes, again, I think it connects two things. Like I Dennis and I, we were talking about the sort of the way that the trade union process there at his job, like how the company was like, we'll accept, we actually want to accept everything you guys are demanding, just don't form the actual union, you know? And we were talking about the sort of, sorry, my dog is trying to eat all of my things. It's you just behave. No, we can't. That there is something that seems to be very central about describing, let's say, for example, if you have the situation where it's politically interesting to prevent a pipeline from being constructed, right? What is the difference between a political process preventing that from happening, in the sense of people getting together, protesting, and then it doesn't get done, and having a very nice state that just passes a law interdicting it from being done, right? The difference is that once the state does that, or the companies like this new green company, they change their mind because it's the best thing to be done, whatever. Like when it's done out of, let's say, a protest or some sort of political movement, you have the movement itself, which was a means for the interdiction. It's also an object, right? You can learn, like once it's done, people have connected in new ways. People have learned that they are capable of new things. Like that's not reducible to the end. That's something that is left as a kind of game. Whereas if the state just interdicts it, you get the goal, but you don't get that growth in those cooperative structures, right? Which is similar to what happened to the discussion on the union. Like, we'll get you the ends, we just don't want those means, because those means, they actually can build on top of them, right? So it seems
they have
like
the capacity to change more, right?
exactly, and it seems like it's very central to cooperative processes and political processes, that what counts as a means can then be treated as an object, which I think is going towards what Renzo was talking about. Like the possibility both that You know, you're part of a process, and that process has parts. But at some point, that process can itself be a part, and there is a larger process which is it is part of, right? Uh, this is something that this sort of objectification of 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 a, some aspect of a process, in that it becomes an object. You can actually look at it's I think it's the minimal form of the system environment change, right? That you make a move, that's like a process, but once the process is done, it's seen from the other side as the product, right? And then you process back on it. So you can, for example, you can treat this sort of uh, acting and then treating the action as an object which you act upon, kind of as this perspective shifts, I think.
Sort of like a logic of what makes political struggle on like a very abstract level, right?
Yeah.
Like when something changes, like for example, like the difference between the employers just giving these rights which people are demanding but not allowing the union, and the union forming and demanding these rights, is that once you have this union, it's not just this one time, you can change it in the future, right? It gives them more power. That's like, it becomes a thing on its own. It's not just this one off.
Yeah, but imagine that it was one off. Okay, you did a protest, and like you organized this protest, and it not only didn't to interdict the pipeline from being built, but it dissolved afterwards. It still might leave some effect, right? I mean, you don't need to be able to, let's say, maintain everything. It can be very dispersed. You can actually apply this to very fluid kind of revolt structures that emerge and disappear very quickly. It's still not necessarily the same as, let's say, if the end goal of some popular unrest was given by the state, because it will leave some imprints on the structure from one way or another, right? So the general logic of this, it's part, I think, of what we were talking about. Like, if you're interested in this sort of compositional level of, I don't know, we want to call it like solidarity built upon cooperation, right? Or this sort of inter-organizational level, you are interested in the fact that things that were means to specific tactical ends or strategic visions, they might serve other purposes, right? They might serve as again, they might become the environment for something, right? So I don't know. It really seems to me like it's a fruitful. It might not be the right formalism because it's very specific to what they were trying to develop, so on. But we might get a good idea for something else. You know, like just those conditions are very interesting, where system and environment are actually treated just as the sort of black box you open. So there's kind of a resolution take on, like, and it's already very kind of compatible with the whole diagrams operad stuff, right? So there might be something there that is useful. I just don't know if the similarity is like very technical to that point, or if it's just we need to look for a different way to approach it. But it does seem like it's a kind of good entry door to give that step, you know, from, okay, you have something singular, you found a way of describing political sites in a very complex world. If the world is that complex, we have the tool, like, it's very natural from this kind of approach we're taking to conclude that there will be very different sites that look very different from each other, because the world is described in a multi-layered, complex way. So it's, you want to be, from that it also follows more naturally as well, that the task of combining in complex way very different heterogeneous political sites requires added machinery. It's not going to be like a natural tendency of things to go in the same direction or to to feed off each other. So
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely has promise, especially because I think like lenses and optics, the motivation for them was trying to give like a general structure that includes both intelligence and like learning systems, right? In order to make a learning system closer to what we would call intelligence. It's kind of their like abstract general goal. So I don't know. I need to look into that stuff more. I still feel like I barely understand it, but that's also true with everything.
me too. Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
gonna say.
Very true. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in this thing from there seems to be one component of perspectivism in it. Like when you count a system as an environment or environment as a system, or which one you count as system, which one you count as environment seems to be a matter of perspective. But I think there's also there's like that material question of when does a process become self-consistent to the point that you can't really ignore it as it has to be, it stops being like kind of the noise of a different system, and it becomes its own system, right? That moment is like not so much, it's not a matter of perspective, but there is actual like moment there, and it's also kind of a threatening moment. It's both threatening to capital in the case of the union, but also it's a problem for the left as well, because you have this tendency of like bad things happen when things get too consistent, right? It becomes like you lose the original kind of spirit of resistance, and now you're kind of the one setting the rules. There's bureaucracy and so on. Like there's a bit of fear of that. So so it seems like that point, that system becomes environment. It has like a history in the leftist movements as it's a pivotal moment, right?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's the thing that I like about this, that like Bogdanov connects very nicely perspective. Like he has a very Einstein kind of vibe with connecting perspective and a kind of relativity that is objective, right? I mean, it's not like you choose out of perspective, again, epistemologically, because you want. Like, sure, what you pick to look into as an organization is arbitrary, but the fact that all these perspectives need to cohere together is ontological, right? So it is a perspective matter, what counts as organization, what counts as environment, let's say, but that those shifts need to be possible and compatible, like in Badiou's sense even, right? It's not epistemological in the sense of it's not up to your arbitrary decision, right?
Yeah, maybe that's it. The compatibility condition is the one that we should imagine, like for like a political process to become compatible with some other thing. Like the simple example is like, when does a movement get recognized by the state as like, this is now something the state has to now deal with, right? The state doesn't care about like a lot of things, probably doesn't care about like this meeting we're having, right? So, but at some point, if this group were to become huge, or well, I don't know, there's some threshold where suddenly it attracts attention and attracts like maybe the wrong kind of attention. Like we were talking about the critical race theory that suddenly became a concern, even though it has been around for a really long time. So yeah, there's that moment where suddenly you can start talking about a system as being independent.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. That specific example is interesting, especially because it was like basically, I don't know if astroturf is the right word, but it was essentially astroturf like super quickly. Like
Mhm.
if you look at like the amount of times that it's like the phrase is mentioned in, I saw this a couple days ago, how many times the phrase is mentioned like in, I think, like news. This is a very American issue, but how many times the phrase critical race theory is mentioned in news? It's like 2018, 2019, 2020, there's like a couple mentions, and then 2021 it's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
Um, even though it's a thing that's been around for a while, and it's also like they frame it as something that's like towards the kids, even though like no kids are actually being taught that specific thing, which is like a perspective in the context of like the American judicial system, right? And like looking at like the history of race in America. Anyways.
Yeah, and it's like I guess yeah, that example, it's kind of an offshoot, right? I mean, it's not like a direct example of a system per se. It's more like a knee-jerk reaction to something else that's happening. But yeah, I guess we could say like since in America, since George Floyd's murder, there was a sense that now like something shifted in the environment of American politics, right?
Yeah.
And now every other group, political group, has to somehow like operate within an environment that was that has this as a concern, as like it's a thing now, right?
Yeah, at least aesthetically, but
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was trying to draw a connection between that and like this optics and Combs thing, because it seems like it's not perspectival. It's not just simply a perspective here. It's like a constraint now. Like you have to deal with race, even if in a negative sense.
Yeah, but I mean, just to make a slight difference, like there, I mean, I remember the whole argument we were having on the the sort of the role of this sort of obscure reception and the reactive reception of novelties, and how these things should be taken into consideration as part of this sort of political world, right, where something new is developing. But it's actually, I think it's easier to talk about when the state recognizes, or when a conservative movement recognizes something that is going on. Usually they're very sensitive. In fact, it's much harder to talk about when I say when a part of the left recognizes some other part of the left in a way that is not, as we were talking about, I approve of this message kind of solidarity. Like, what like it's weird that it's easier, for example, for something that the left does to make a difference for the state, or because I don't know, capitalists are very sensitive about losing money. Like as soon as that begins, they catch it on very early. Or people whose worldviews are in danger, like not out of abstract morals issues, but very practical kind of self-identification, or the way they map the world. Those things getting to become like in danger, people react quickly. But a part of the left is doing something like a political campaign, can go very far into being oblivious to some other process that is happening simultaneously, right? Like it's easier for the left to be noise for the left than for the left to be noise for the state. That's kind of amazing, I guess.
Or for the right too.
Yeah.
Like they see it less as noise as well. But I think this also connects to how often I think how you're talking about this, like this solidarity, which is just like we support you. It seems that often in right-wing movements, they sort of have like a stronger tool of solidarity somehow, where they, I don't know, there's like a phrase in the US, what is it, that like I forget what it was, but like basically the conservatives always like end up falling in line. Like when you see just look at like Donald Trump, for example, the entire party immediately was like this, became except for like two people just went right behind him. But like that sort of unity in the left wing is, I think maybe that's an American phenomenon, I don't know, but I think it's harder to build, at least in America today, like real solidarity in that sense on the left.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some of it has to do with these like cultural or like culture war, whatever issues. That's how the right like really gets people excited.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think like, for example, I think in Brazil, because our recent political history, like the last 10, 15 years on the left, the theme of unity of the left was such an ideological thing. Like it was usually used as a way to kind of, okay, let's remove some people from the equation, especially people who are not organized around political parties and things like this. That I think that we are very kind of sensitive to the problem of positively proposing what this sort of solidarity should look like.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, I think this is becoming more. I mean, I don't know what to say in that sense, because, for example, I look at the Black Socialists of America trying to come up with an app for mapping cooperatives around the country. Like that seems like very clearly trying to, facilitate some connective, like a positive and sort of planned connectivity between different endeavors. Even though I think it's quite kind of specific into what they want to register in their app. Like they don't want to there's not like everything that is being done is going to be relevant, right? Whereas in Brazil, it seems like more like in Europe, like in France, these sorts of revolts that are massive, sometimes in size or but not really, not going to last that long, like as a specific organization, that they pose a different sort of problem. There is no Black Socialists of America app. How do those things interact? It's not like a positive sense of let's unify in this way or that way. It's not gonna be very meaningful. So it's hard to come up with a view of these topics of connectivity between singular political processes that is flexible enough to allow for not simply purposeful planning of coordinating together things, but things that might kind of riff off each other, even though they're in some level they're quite oblivious to the internal dynamic of each other. They don't really give a shit. Like they might even hate each other. Like one are the white university students, and I don't know, the indigenous movement. They're practically in different worlds, if not by capitalism holding them together. And they don't really care about each other, most likely, but still there might be interesting political tools that facilitate one not being pure noise to the other, right? Like, so there is a good reason to make it very kind of plastic, the approach to this thing. By the way, I'm looking to see if anyone wrote anything on symmetric monoidal categories enforcing. There is apparently nothing on the topic to facilitate our little discussion. So
yeah, so just to bring it back to what you were just saying, like trying to tie it together with other things. So imagine so you have these different movements or groups, they don't necessarily care about each other. There are some thin threads connecting them, but not, it's like more abstract than like actual. So then when we talk about like sharing resources, maybe the first resource that needs to be shared is this like sensory thing that you were talking about, Gabriel, but also like what matters to these groups and how do we connect what matters together? Or is it like making an additional sense that's independent of what the groups are trying to achieve? I guess there's different ways to do this, but seems like that's a resource sharing issue as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that, for example, I mean, I'm very inclined because I really think the topic is a central topic today. Like even with the whole idea with the platform, it touched on this idea that, you know, mapping of a situation is a resource, right?
Yeah.
In some sense, having money is also having a resource for mapping the world. I would put it inside the same sort of problem. Like it might be that in some situations, kind of coordinating information about who does what where is a thing that is useful to share. We might not be able to say beforehand that this should be shared in every situation because it might not always be the case, but it's useful perhaps to construct these things in such a way that this is a possibility, right, to talk about these things. So, and again, I think that's why I really like that ridiculous speculation that I proposed a couple of meetings ago, that there seems to be a very strict connection between how things are composed, what is intelligible to them, again, not in the knowledge sense of a theory that they have, but in the sense of what they can sense, right? What is immediately intelligible to that composed body, and what it can intervene upon. Like it seems like there is a connection between these three dimensions: what you can change, what you can kind of sense, and what you can and how you are composed, right, or how you are organized. And that seems to have something to do both with, you know, how you are organized, has something to do also with that kind of port perspective of how you can be connected to other things. So how you are organized and how you can be organized by something else, like by an environment, by some constraints. Like that's kind of the same. So what constraints you can pass seems connected to that. Like what you can sense and what therefore is mappable or relevant to be mapped, or what you can help to make intelligible seems kind of connected as well. And you know what you can change or intervene upon, and how those changes can kind of resonate with other changes and accumulate force and things like this seems to be also like you could extrapolate from this trinity from the organization to the environment, you know, like organization, intelligibility, and intervention kind of becomes how you connect, you know, how you map the environment, and let's say what is kind of adding on of change upon change, right? Like the sort of proper world change in a way, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, yeah, those three things seem to map kind of well onto, at least two of those map into the forward and the backwards part of the optics thing, like mapping actions forward and some information about the environment back, maybe. Yeah, but I was thinking of a simple example of adding sensors, which is simply like, does your leadership, like if it's, I don't know, the LGBTQ movement, information. If you want your organization to be sensitive to that movement, one kind of basic way is just to have people in the leadership of your organization be queer, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Like, exactly as you said, imagine that you want to be conductive or to participate or to be affected or have some relation to some specific queer organization, right? If you're totally oblivious, like you're not composed in certain ways, it's much harder to let's say be affected by things that make a difference to that other organization, right?
Exactly.
So there,
Yeah.
I mean, you actually get the three things because you need to be composed in some ways so that when you intervene, you get to map information in some ways, right? So let's say if you're a white cis heteronormative ally of the queer movement, right? You go together to a protest, or you participate in some action. Since the cost of, you know, even better example, but well, that example works as well. The cost of, for example, harassing a white middle class rich person is much higher, much harder to do than harassing a trans person. The reaction to that protest that you did together will be unevenly distributed, meaning like the queer organization with queer people actually actively involved in it will suffer a reaction and will have to readjust and respond to it in a way that your organization of allies, but which are internally totally kind of removed from that political process, you won't feel like anything needs to be changed.
Yeah.
Right? So it actually connects, like the sort of parts you have into the environment are actually conditioned on the compositional part, right? So composition is not one of the arrows going in and out, is the sort of building of the box, right? Depending on how it's built, this in and out part sends different information. It goes the same for, like, again, composition of small militant organizations and the Black movement, for example. And then you say, no, let's just do a protest and say fuck the police. Like, yeah, but I mean, you say this and then you go home and I stay here with the guys. Like, it makes all the difference. So you can actually kind of have a language to talk about how those three things move together. They're connected variables, right? Depending on how you're composed, things will make difference. You are both capable of intervening on things differently and also kind of getting very different feedback, or at least sensing the feedback differently, right? What will make a difference in that will change.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that this is a nice way to think about, like,
And fuck, man, now that you
impersonal, like an impersonal identity.
yeah, and
not,
you know, like,
not of individual.
yeah, I mean, now that I think of it, like, you know, if you want to make like a systemic perturbation, it's like a generic perturbation, right? A generic perturbation to a system, in a social system, from following this reasoning further to the sort of generic in Badiou, it would take a highly heterogeneous composition to actually, you know, be able to make a highly, like, systemic intervention that actually senses something highly generic about the effect, right? So you can actually so you can actually bind this together again. Like, you would need a highly generic procedure, political procedure, to be able to intervene in such a way that it can actually read the reaction as being a systemic reaction, right?
Yeah. It's like you have this little, like, radio frequency thing. You can tune into different frequencies, and each one is kind of a different perturbations in the world.
Yeah.
But that's limited by your composition and how, basically how diverse it is. And the limit of that would be this generic perturbation, which it's like the highest frequency, or I don't know, it's
Yeah.
a frequency that most would get. It's counted as noise for
Yeah, it would
almost
be like
every
a weird noise.
yeah.
It's a
I
weird
mean,
noise that would make a difference, right?
Yeah, it's a noise that makes
That,
it.
like, you
Yeah,
wouldn't
exactly.
expect that.
But I mean, we're very close to a very hippie kind of idea, you know, where like collectives vibe on a certain frequency and then they interact with things that resonate with that frequency. But it's kind of, I mean, it has that kind of idea that depending on how you compose, I mean, the wires that go in and out, they will actually be made of something. They will be sensitive to some things, not others, right? And then you have this double problem, which is, I think that the stakes of the challenge are clearer, because in one way, you need many different of these processes to come up with a very generic, like a very heterogeneous sort of environment or larger system. But the more heterogeneous it is, the harder to pitch them together in any relevant way, right? So there is actually a weird trade-off where, again, the more generic you are, the more singular in that sense, the harder it is to establish solidarity, right? In this objective way, because it might start hindering your own thing. So I don't know. I think it does bring us closer to something, you know.
That sort of reminds me of like the reverse, I guess, of what you would expect in, this is like a big idea. I forget what the official name for it is, but a big idea in like model theory and set theory, that when you like constrain the system more, you can actually get more expressivity out of it, right? That like more
Yeah.
rules on a model can sometimes make the model bigger,
More expressive,
in
yeah.
a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not bigger in terms of like what everybody, yeah, but more expressive.
Yeah.
But also one thing I want to go that sort of connects to what we were talking about before, but when you said these like three, I guess these three axes of a world, right? Which is like a change, sensing, and then composing.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say, right? So sensing is like on like the phenomenology axis, right? You say composing, since we had like the phenomenological versus the epistemological, that's sort of what the composition feels like. It's on that, it's like dealing with like the model when you have like explicit, I guess, connections and what, I don't know if you
Yeah, I would put
see that connection?
the composing on the side of, I mean, politically on the side of how things are organized or their actual structure, right?
Yeah, so that would be on the side of like an epistemology of building some kind of model for.
But why model? Like, for example,
Because you never, I mean, you never know if the way that you say it's actually structured is like the way, in the sense that not, maybe not, you never know, but.
yeah, but I mean, for example, in the example we were giving, right? Saying, for example, two organizations which become allies in the in LGBT movement. One of them is only composed of white, cis normative, heteronormative students. The other is, let's say, you know, collective of transgender sex workers. You say that the way they are composed affects the sort of feedback they get from the same interaction with the environment. You're not talking about epistemology, right? Epistemology would come, for example, on how you will interpret information and connect it back to composition. But it would be like a kind of organizational condition. It would be closer to, let's say, the instrumental discussion on experiments, right? Depending on how experiments are materially built, they can capture certain difference. Like that's more on the, my impression is that more on the instrumental side than the epistemological side, even though the two are connected, right?
Mhm.
Like having some model will inform probably how you build your experiment, but it's the actual building of the experiment that is gonna materially kind of make you available for a perturbation or make the perturbation possible to even
I
sense,
see.
right?
So the being of an epistemological claim is, I guess, empirical is what you're saying.
Yeah, it would be more on the kind of material side than on the model side, even though the two are, I agree with you, the
That
two are
makes sense, yeah.
connected. Like,
Because you have to do something to know something.
yeah,
You have to
exactly.
do something in the
So
world, yeah. That makes sense. Okay.
yeah, like that's how I would think about it. Like, imagine that composition is how you're bringing up, how are parts being brought together so that they interact in some way. Well, that constrains what sort of effect from an interaction that thing or that collective or that experiment can actually sense, right?
But yeah, but there's still a sense that it's not always that the internal, like the at least presupposed composition of an organization defines like the range, the diversity of effects, right? Because sometimes what you think is the internal diversity that should be able to produce like your effectivity might just like work against you, like so
Yeah.
like you might think that like a diverse internal composition of an organization will produce the most diverse effects, but nothing stops for that just being noise, like just
Yeah,
noise,
exactly. Yeah.
right? So there's also the opposite case where, like the example of the memes, how it's an idea of how by like using a yellow vest is just like enforcing this kind of like indifferent difference inside the movement allows for the greatest like range of effects, and like the most generic perturbation in this case is brought by this kind of like radical, at least in the
Uniformity,
formal,
right?
yeah
Yeah, but I
so
mean,
there's a,
I think the two I agree on. I don't think the two arguments are the same,
yeah they
but
seem to,
because I mean, like, I think that you can actually go further than that and say that in some situation you might need like something ridiculously restricted, as Yasha was saying, in order to. I mean, more than that, you could simply say that sometimes you only learn what's relevant in your composition by the effect to begin with, right? So you
yeah.
might think, for example, that uh, organizing in some horizontal or some particular way is going to make you more effective. Then you find out that that's not the case. You should have the flexibility from the effects to change your own constitution based on that. So I think first of all, there is not a direct, it's not a planned, controlled dimension. It's these three variables should all interact with one another, right? Like how you compose should limit somehow how you can interact and how you can sense change reactions, but reactions can actually change how you compose, and therefore themselves change how you act anew, right? So you shouldn't have to choose one as being the main propeller. But in that particular case of the yellow vest, I think that there's actually something else, which is, I wonder what is the correct level of analysis where you get this uniformity, but inside of it, as you said, it becomes very, very, I mean, it's not simply heterogeneous, it's more to the side of the anonymous, right? It's not simply like, look how diverse it is. That's not the proper statement to capture it, right? It's look how it doesn't really matter what's beyond this point. So, I mean, I think it's not a matter of stating positively what the correlation is between composition and effects. For example, perhaps the statement to be to be as heterogeneous as possible is always desirable is too strong a statement, because nothing guarantees that genericity is the same as having a bunch of different predicates. It might be something more specific than that, right? In a certain political situation. But I think it's just going as far as saying that there is a correlation between what an organization can sense from its effect, from the effects, right, from the reaction to its effect, to its actions and its composition, that those three dimensions are connected of intelligibility, organization, and intervention, right? You know, one thing that I mean, I really think we never really talk about this, but because it's like just such a depressing abyss of a theme, but you know, climate change, I think it's a really good topic for this approach. Like, because when you talk to people who are very much engaged on climate activism and things like this, people are so kind of desperate and frustrated with the fact that, you know, it's such a scientific consensus and such a absolutely kind of urgent topic, and at the same time it's so hard to mobilize people to make them seem like they see it, right? And nobody explains like the negation of climate deniers very easily, and it seems like there is a connection between, you know, what you can intervene on, what you actually accept as relevant information about climate change, and the sort of political bodies people are allowed to constitute themselves. Like, it's almost like this complete destruction of internationalism is now biting the world in the ass. You know, like, there are no international planetary political bodies, therefore there is no composition at the level of climate change. You know, it is kind of the sort of crisis that would require some sort of weirdly generic thing to be at the same sort of kind of homogeneity to it, right? Something that could actually, again, vibe in the same, resonate in the same kind of scale.
Yeah, you're saying, like, I guess, like, given like the like both globalization and like heterogeneity of the world and how it can kind of like, it's very interconnected. It seems like from the outside, like, this should be the perfect place for this kind of like coming together on this issue.
Yeah,
But
exactly. You would expect that it's you have news from all over the world, have science, but if you look at it like I have a friend who studies just this issue, and she's coming. I mean, a really good paper that came out today. It's really good on this point that they find a statistical correlation between trust in science and climate negation. Like, not distrust in science and being a climate denier. Actually, the more you trust it, the more tendency you have to be a kind of a denial fanatic thing.
I wonder if this has to do with like a progress fetishism, sort of like a will, like a if we do enough capitalism, we'll figure it out kind of.
Yeah, I think
That's the argument that a lot of.
Yeah, I think it has that feel, but it also has a weird situation where a lot of political activists in climate issues, they want scientific circulation of ideas to substitute this sort of political connectivity problem. It's the circulation of about science should be enough to compose like this big political consensus, right? Political consensus is built of political composition. It's not built of scientific statements. Like, they're not made of the same thing, right? So I don't know, probably aliens who tell the story of how the human race was extinguished in, I don't know, 2150 or something will say it's funny because like around 1930, 1940, they were starting like this international workers international thing. They had a shot, you know, at being at the level of planetary change, like as a sort of organizational body, but then it just went to shit and they just got destroyed.
Would you say like this is what I'm getting the sense of, that I guess like the main like current impetus of most of the movement, in the sense that where you're saying like about just like, I guess, like educating and not necessarily making the connections, is like too much emphasis on like the sense aspect, right? Of like allowing the conditions for people to see that it's a thing, right? So everyone maybe not, you can sense it on a day-to-day, but everyone has some sense of what it means, at least, right?
Yeah, no, I
It's-
disagree
it's
with
in-
that.
it's- yeah.
Like, I think that people might have a knowledge, but I
Mm.
mean, just take the example you gave early on today. Like, I think climate change is very nicely kind of projected into a sort of topological problem where global properties are not seen from local perspectives, right?
Sure.
And you can't tell a Euclidean being you live in a non-Euclidean space. Like, you can know that, but that's not the same as
Mhm.
connecting like a Jordan curve that is only
Yeah.
possible in a strange topological space. Like, connecting that, I think, is a topic of what we were discussing today. What does it mean to actually connect parts of the world in such a way that they have a non-trivial topology, right?
Mhm.
I think that's the thing that we're substituting in climate activism sometimes for knowledge about an abstract object. It's not the same. Like,
Mhm.
for example, under some inexistent utopian regime where producers of some rural product in Brazil need to coordinate through some meaningful way with producers somewhere else in the world, it's very likely that that information is actually concretely sensible. Like, there are objects that are the size of the world, and if you're cooperating and information is actually being shared and that information makes a difference, probably coming up with a sense for climate change would be less of an issue, rather than saying, look, absolute competition, geopolitical mayhem, but you have the knowledge of science and do something about it. Like,
Mm.
it's no wonder it's not going to mobilize no one, right? So
The fact that flat earthers are growing right now, it's just
it's perfect. Yes,
Yeah.
fact
exactly.
about the world being it being a more effective way of like connecting
Yeah,
people, even though we live in like a globe in which science is able to say we live in a globe. Like,
exactly. I mean, I think flat earthers give the truth of the climate crisis. Like, it is a similar, like, they're the purest conspiracy. That's why they're my favorite one. Like, the purest kind of pathology of totality. No, it's literally like the topological problem. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's true.
I really like it, man, and I find it very amazing, like, that they just so in your face, And I mean, this actually builds up to my private position, which is you won't get to probably solve climate change without, communism. So, like, solve climate change and then get to communism. I think it's unfortunately the other way around. Like, probably we're fucked.
Probably we're fucked.
Yeah. But it's a strange, it's a nice argument. Yeah,
Yeah.
At least we have that argument now.
at least
least
while
we-
we're dying,
we have
we'll
this
say
example.
we told you so.
Yeah.
That's true. All right.
Anyway, guys, I need to run. I need to cook dinner here.
Okay. Yeah. Of course. This is a good little discussion.
Yeah, I think it ended on a high, like a nice,
Inevitable
note of-
destruction.
a nice,
Doom.
yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Great, guys.
Do
All
we
right.
have ideas for the next week?
I just got
Actually-
this new Nunes book. I'm gonna start reading it. You guys didn't talk- it looks
Yeah,
good.
I thought we could invite him at some point, if you guys are up for it. But I'm not sure if we want to have a meeting on his book in the near future. I do have one idea that actually I was talking to Dennis about it today. Like, we're starting to plan like a more structural kind of skeleton for what would like a book project around the primer and those ideas look like. And I think it would be cool to perhaps have like a summary and then talk about, what would an argument that actually fills in all the gaps look like, even if we don't know what goes where, perhaps at some point that could be a nice meeting to do as well. And yeah, I'm gonna start studying this optics combs stuff. So probably in the near future, I'm gonna try to unload my doubts on you guys.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to all those. I like all those ideas.
Yeah.
Let's talk through what's up as well. Just see what everyone think. I know Caron had an idea on what to present as well. So I don't know. We should check there.
Gabriel, did Raquel said anything about like like the meetings in Portuguese and
No, we're meeting next week. She's actually coming to Rio and she's staying here. But I haven't spoken to her about it this last couple of days. But I'll let you know. Guys, have to run.
Okay.
All right, take care.
Yeah.
We're good
Bye,
night.
guys.
Bye.